In the headlines, President Park Geun-hye vows to realize an education system that breaks away from traditional models to stress creativity. Hyundai Motor Group agrees to pay $100 million for exaggerating fuel efficiency for more than 1 million cars sold in the U.S., the largest civil penalty ever under the Clean Air Act. And voting for the U.S. midterm elections, seen as a referendum for the Obama administration, begins Tuesday. Hello and welcome to ARIRANG News, coming to you live from Seoul. I am Kang Chery. It would be fair to say that Korean parents' zeal for their children's education and the rapid development of education have largely contributed to helping Korea rise from the ashes in a matter of just decades. At a special forum on education in Seoul, South Korean President Park Geun-hye talked about fostering creative talents to bring Korean and global education systems up a notch. Choi Yoo-sun reports.
President Park Geun-hye at a symposium co-organized by Seoul and the World Bank on Tuesday said the time has come for the Korean education system to transform in the face of new challenges in the 21st century. The president referred to her talks with World Bank President Kim Yong-kim last year when they agreed that innovation and creativity are the foundation of sustainable growth and that it's education that can foster such talents at the center of a creative economy.
저는 우리 교육이 혁신을 이루어낼 창의적인 아이디어와 도전 정신을 키워내는 원천이 되어야 한다고 생각합니다. 개개인의 잠재된 능력을 최대한 끌어올려서 아이디어와 열정으로 가득한 융합 인재를 길러내는 창의 인재 양성 교육으로 변해야 합니다.
Korea recently participated in the UN Global Education First Initiative and joined the Global Partnership for Education in its bid to play a more active role in international efforts to enhance the quality of education in the developing world.
그동안 축적해온 교육의 노하우에 선진국의 우수 사례를 접목하고 이제까지의 교육 패러다임을 뛰어넘는 행복 교육, 창의 교육을 실현해서 우리 교육의 발전은 물론 세계 교육의 발전에도 기여해 나가기를 기대하고 있습니다.
The World Bank president also at the event said Korea's GDP could annually expand 0.6% for 20 years if the country narrows the gap between male and female workforce participation. He then called on Koreans to break down the social and economic hierarchies that often prevent women and youth from unleashing their potential. Choi Yoo-sun, ARIRANG News.
Deregulation is a key part of the Park Geun-hye administration's plan to boost the domestic economy. And as part of such efforts, the Korean government is easing restrictions within its free economic zones to make them more attractive for investment. Kim Ji-yeon has the details.
The Korean government is easing regulations on its 8 free economic zones to increase the number of developers and thereby make it less of a pain for businesses to invest there. The Ministry of Trade, Industry and Energy says it will lower the minimum requirement of developmental areas from the previous 330 to 200 square meters. The move will also give investors a higher rate of return, as the minimum reinvestment rate is being lowered from 25% to 10% of the profits generated from operating within the zones. Given the benefits, the move is expected to boost the number of private investors, as landowners and their associations will now be able to participate as developers of the zones. The ministry says it plans to raise $20 billion worth of economic benefit from the zones over the next 10 years.
The easing of restrictions is a move toward inducing more investment and development in the free economic zones, particularly in those that are still undeveloped.
There are currently 88 districts within the 8 free economic zones in Korea. A zone in Chungbuk and the East Coast Free Economic Zone were added to the list last year as part of efforts to revive the local economy. But despite a number of measures introduced over the years, more than 40% of the districts are currently undeveloped due to low participation. Kim Ji-yeon, ARIRANG News.
Hyundai Motor and Kia Motors have been hit with a massive fine by the U.S. government for misleading customers about the fuel economy for many of their cars sold in the U.S. They've agreed to pay $100 million in fines and forfeit $200 million worth of carbon credits. Shin Se-min reports.
Hyundai Motor and Kia Motors have been hit with a record fine of a combined $350 million in United States for overstating fuel economy standards on more than 1 million automobiles. That was the settlement reached on Monday between the Korean Auto Group and U.S. authorities. The fine itself amounts to $100 million. Under the terms, Hyundai and Kia will also forfeit greenhouse gas emission credits worth over $200 million and spend another $50 million on measures to prevent violations in the future. The penalty is the largest ever issued under the Clean Air Act. David Zuchowski, the president and chief executive officer of Hyundai Motor America, said in a statement that his company had acted transparently, reimbursed affected customers, and fully cooperated with the investigation, and that the company was pleased to put the issue behind them. This week's settlement comes 2 years after Hyundai and Kia conceded that they had overstated fuel efficiency standards by between 1 to 6 miles per gallon for a 2-year period on automobiles sold in the U.S. They agreed at the time to compensate drivers of the affected automobiles by issuing debit cards. That admission came after the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency investigated more than a dozen Hyundai and Kia models for fuel efficiency discrepancies in response to consumer complaints. Shin Se-min, ARIRANG News.
And more bad news for Hyundai. The company's market share in the U.S. dropped to 3.9% last month. This is the first time in 4 years that Hyundai Motors' U.S. market share fell below the 4% mark. Hyundai Motors says it sold around 50,000 new vehicles last month, down 6.5% from the same period last year. The automaker blamed the weak yen, giving its Japanese rivals price competitiveness. Now, over at another international event in Korea's port city of Busan, the International Telecommunication Union's meeting, which comes to a close in just about 3 days, has adopted an agenda to promote the Internet of Things. Song Ji-sun has more.
The International Telecommunications Union, for the first time, adopted an agenda regarding the Internet of Things, which was proposed by this year's host, South Korea. IoT refers to the connection of devices and objects through the Internet, and Seoul had proposed that it be facilitated to prepare for the future. Less than 1% of these objects are currently connected to the Internet, but that number is expected to jump 10 times on the back of cloud computing and big data technologies, with the market size expanding by 5 times its current level to over $8 trillion by the year 2020. While the IoT stands to open new business opportunities for startups, supporting developing countries in their pursuit of the IoT remains a challenge for the ITU, as the resources in those nations are limited. According to the IoT index filed by the International Data Corporation last year, South Korea is the second most prepared country among G20 members after the United States, and with the latest adoption of its agenda, Seoul aims to expand its presence in setting global standards and supporting developing nations in IoT-related projects of ITU. Seoul's ICT Ministry has also designated IoT Week Korea 2014 for Wednesday to next Friday, where solutions and products related to IoT will be presented at multiple events at COEX and other locations around the capital and Busan. Song Ji-sun, ARIRANG News.
Korea's consumer prices rebounded for the first time in 4 months in October, but the inflation rate remained in the 1% range, where it's been for 2 years. As Statistics Korea says prices grew 1.2% last month from the previous year. That falls well below the Bank of Korea's inflation target band of 2.5% and 3.5%. The agency attributes this slow growth to the falling prices of farming goods and crude oil. Korea's low birth rate and its aging society are putting pressure on the country's national budget. These factors could make a tax rate hike a necessity. According to a report by the National Assembly Budget Office, the national debt will amount to $13.5 trillion by the year 2060 if there are no additional tax rate increases. That's nearly 1.7%. That is times larger than the country's expected GDP in the year 2060, meaning the average Korean citizen would be about $300,000 in actual debt. The report adds the government may not be able to repay its debt through state bonds starting from the year 2033. One of Japan's best-known writers, who is also a very popular figure here in South Korea, has taken his own country to task for denying responsibility for the wartime atrocities carried out by the Japanese military. Kim Min-ji has more.
Japanese writer Haruki Murakami has condemned his country for trying to evade responsibility for its wartime atrocities. In an interview with Japan's Mainichi Shimbun, Murakami noted that next year marks the 70th year since the end of World War II, but that Tokyo continues to miss the point that it was the assailant. Citing the Japanese way of thinking in regards to the war, the writer says that the Japanese believed they were the victims and that the emperor was exploited and its citizens deceived. Murakami added that eventually it was concluded that no one was wrong and that he understood why China and Korea feel resentment towards Japan today. Murakami says he saw similarities in the 2011 Fukushima Daiichi nuclear accident. He said that Japan did not look into who was really responsible and instead placed the blame on the earthquake and tsunami, believing they were all victims. Murakami, one of Japan's best-known authors and a longtime candidate for the Nobel Prize in Literature, is famous for bestsellers including Norwegian Wood and the 1Q84 trilogy. Kim Min-ji, ARIRANG News.
The United States has tightened security screening for travelers from countries under the U.S. visa waiver program in a bid to prevent foreign fighters from Syria and Iraq from entering the country. U.S. Secretary of State, Secretary of Homeland Security, that is, Mr. Johnson, says people from countries under the waiver program will have to provide additional information on an electronic application before they're allowed into the United States. The move is in response to security threats from foreign fighters holding Western passports, which enables them to travel with relative ease to Europe and the United States. There are almost 40 European and Asian countries under the U.S. visa waiver program, including South Korea. South Korea is the 25th best country to live in. That's according to a British think tank. Its latest index notes Korea's economy and education, but says the country would be well served to learn from countries like Norway and Switzerland in other areas. Kwon So-ah has the story.
South Korea is the 25th most prosperous country out of 142 countries around the world, according to a Prosperity Index report released by the British-based Legatum Institute. This year's ranking is a notch higher than last year. Korea's best ranking was 24th in 2011. Norway topped the list for the 6th consecutive year. It was followed by Switzerland and New Zealand. The three most prosperous Asian countries are Singapore, Japan, and Hong Kong. The report says South Korea is the 5th best Asian country to live in. African nations filled out the majority of the bottom spots, with the Central African Republic propping up the rest. While GDP is usually the most common way to assess a country's prosperity level, the Legatum report says its definition of prosperity is more than, quote, just the accumulation of material wealth. That's why the institute measures countries by 8 categories. Korea performs strongly in economy and education, ranking 9th and 15th respectively. But the personal freedom and social capital divisions are weak.
Korea remains stuck in the mid-20 level because of its overall welfare situation. In terms of day-to-day welfare, Korea is still an awfully long way behind countries like Norway and Switzerland. If we do not make changes there, Korea seen from the outside may be a country seen as a nice place to visit, but not one of the best to live in.
But analysts are optimistic that the government's latest efforts to improve its welfare policies could boost Korea's position on the Prosperity Index list in the coming years. Kwon So-ah, ARIRANG News.
So some reports show Korea may be considered one of the best countries to live in. Unfortunately, though, some children living in Korea beg to differ. A nationwide survey of about 4,000 households with children under the age of 18 found that Korean children and teenagers were the least satisfied with their lives among OECD member states. Korea scored just over 60 points on a scale of 100. The Netherlands came in first at 94.2 points, followed by Iceland and Finland. Korea's welfare ministry says the dissatisfaction stems from pressure to do well in school, bullying, violence, and internet addiction. The number of one-person households in Korea has been growing in recent years because more young people choose to delay marriage or even to live alone. This relatively new demographic has sparked off a so-called solo economy and a wave of new consumer trends. Park Geun-hye tells us more.
Single-person households now make up more than 25% of Korea's total households. Statistics Korea says the ratio will increase to 1 in 3 by 2035. The rising number of singles in the country has begun to make an impression on the economy, and their distinct lifestyle is changing the landscape of the consumer market. For example, home appliance companies have been keen to cater to their special needs, rolling out products like mini rice cookers and small-load washing machines to slimmer refrigerators. The businesses say solo dwellers prefer appliances that are well-equipped with multi-functions in refined and compact designs. Increased revenues for convenience stores is another indication of the growing presence of single-person households. Recent statistics by the Bank of Korea show the amount of credit card transactions from January to July at convenience stores this year has increased about 15% from the same period last year, while large chain retailers saw a decrease, largely due to a slump in consumer spending after the April fair disaster. Analysts say an increase in sales for convenience stores is closely linked to the purchasing habits of single people. The purchasing power of solo dwellers has turned out to be stronger than that of 3 to 4 member households, according to the Korea Chamber of Commerce and Industry. As the country's population of single people continues to grow, so has demand for single-person housing units and personal finance managers to help them prepare for their senior years alone. Park Ji-won, ARIRANG News.
Americans head to the polls on this Tuesday for the U.S. midterm elections. To tell us more about this and other stories, Paul E. is joining us from the News Center. Paul, this is being seen as one of the most pivotal midterm elections in years, with the Democrats desperately trying to hold on to the control of Congress.
Well, the result of this vote is expected to have far-reaching effects on the government and the country's path to economic recovery. 1/3 of the seats in the Senate are open, with most of the House of Representatives up for grabs. The latest polls are favoring Republicans as President Obama's numbers continue to fall. Our Connie Lee reports.
Voters in the U.S. are heading to the polls on this Tuesday. A power shift in Congress could be underway, as the midterm elections are being seen as a referendum on President Barack Obama.
These midterm elections are an up or down vote on President Obama in terms of his stewardship of the economy, what's going on in foreign policy, and also his overall popularity.
Many races are tight or too close to call, but recent polls have been forecasting Republican gains, with many showing them taking charge of both the House of Representatives and the Senate. Voters will be electing candidates for all 435 seats in the House and 36 seats in the Senate. If Republicans hold on to their current seats and add 6 more in the House, they will hold a majority and make it a tough final 2 years for the Obama administration. On the issue of the economy, a Pew Research Center poll shows more voters believe the Republicans would do a better job than President Obama.
I don't think he's done a good job for what he said, and I don't think he was ever going to do a good job.
But there are others who think the president has a decent record.
I love him. He's doing all right. If it wasn't for him, I wouldn't be where I'm at today.
President Obama, supporting Democratic candidates at a rally in Illinois, reminded voters of his administration's achievements.
Over the past 4.5 years, our businesses have created more than 10 million new jobs. Housing market that was reeling is now rebounding. Auto industry that was wheezing is now roaring back.
The Ebola crisis and America's involvement in the fight against Islamic State are also factors likely to affect this year's midterms. Connie Lee, ARIRANG News.
And Paul, let's stay with President Obama for a while. The U.S. leader hosted Federal Reserve Chair Janet Yellen at the White House on this Monday. The U.S. economy has been a flashpoint issue lately, especially with the recent decision by the Fed to end its QE stimulus policy. How did the talks play out in the Oval Office?
Well, the White House said the two leaders discussed the near and long-term outlooks for the global economy, as well as that of the U.S. Financial market reforms are also at the top of the agenda as U.S. regulators are working on the Dodd-Frank Wall Street Reform Act. That's legislation aimed at strengthening the nation's financial infrastructure following the 2007 credit crisis. The closed-door meeting was the first time the two met one-on-one since Yellen assumed her post as the chief of the American Central Bank back in February. It also comes ahead of Obama's trip through Asia that will also take him to Australia for a meeting of the G20 this Sunday.
And shifting now to the political crisis in Burkina Faso, the country's military has been given a deadline by the African Union to hand over power to a civilian body or face a range of sanctions. What are the conditions for this ultimatum?
Well, following an emergency meeting in Ethiopia on Monday, the African Union Security Council gave Burkina Faso's military leadership 2 weeks to return the West African state to civilian authorities. The AU accused the army of acting unconstitutionally when it seized control after President Blaise Compaoré was forced to resign last Friday in the wake of mass protests. The 54-member bloc said the move was against democracy, saying the popular uprising belonged to the people.
We have asked the armed forces of Burkina Faso to transfer power to the civilian transitional government. The African Union Peace and Security Council has determined a period of 2 weeks starting tomorrow for the transfer of power to the civilian administration from the military.
In response, the country's interim president, Lieutenant Colonel Isaac Zida, said he will concede power to a transitional government and appoint a new head of state. Zida, however, has not offered a timetable for the transfer.
And finally, Paul, the president of the World Bank has put Asia's leading countries on notice, saying they're failing to do their part in combating the Ebola outbreak in West Africa. So what's at the center of this criticism?
Well, speaking in Seoul on Tuesday, World Bank Chief Jim Yong Kim said that many Asian countries are not contributing enough to the global effort in fighting Ebola. This despite having a wealth of trained medical personnel to stop the spread of the deadly virus. Kim said that thousands of trained healthcare workers are needed over the next year in the hardest hit countries in West Africa, namely Liberia, Guinea, and Sierra Leone. He appealed to countries to quit using stopgap measures and to halt the Ebola epidemic at its source.
Focusing only on border control is not the right response. The world needs to put the fire out at its source, because if it doesn't, Ebola could spread to any country, including those here in Asia.
Korea has already pledged nearly $6 million to tackle the health crisis and is planning to send a joint military-civilian medical team to West Africa later this month. China has also donated $123 million to the cause. However, the overall response from Asia is still lagging behind compared to Western states. Chery?
All right, thank you so much, Paul. Really appreciate it. And we'll see you back here in just about 2 hours.
Hello everyone, I'm Kim Bo-kyung with the weather updates. Currently, we are enjoying typical late autumn conditions nationwide due to a high pressure system from the West Sea. But keep in mind that the big gap in temperatures between the days and nights will continue. But warm autumn conditions have allowed temperatures to return back to the seasonal average range. Other than that, at the moment, a dry weather watch remains in effect for parts of the central regions, including Seoul. Well, it looks like some good news that mercury will continue to rise tomorrow. Otherwise, showers are forecast for the eastern coast and Jeju towards the end of the week. On to tomorrow's readings. Seoul reaches 18, Daegu peaks at 19. On to other regions. Daejeon hits 16, while Jeju and Dokdo make it to the mid-teens. That's all the updates I have for you now. I'll be back with more after 10.
Thanks, Bo-kyung, and that will do it for this edition of ARIRANG News. Thanks for watching.